Good morning, everybody. I hope everybody's well this morning. I'm Pastor Alan. It's so good to be with you. Special word of welcome to everybody at the Ascent and everybody at the Union Cross campus. Are you ready for some good news? When you see Jesus in the New Testament mad, pause, pay attention, because there's actually good news in it. Because if you can see what Jesus gets most mad about, you'll find out what he cares about most. And when you find out what he cares about most, then you'll find out about the love of God for you. We are in a study on the life of Peter, and today we come back to Matthew chapter 16. I say back here because this is actually where we began our journey with the wondrous confession of Christ's lordship. And today we come to an amazingly stark, contrasting scene. In fact, I think what I'll do is read in Matthew 16 back to verse 13, where we started this whole series on Peter, and then I'll continue up through verse 23. Matthew 16 at verse 13. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." And he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. And that's where we began our journey with Peter, because it's at the central point of the blessing of Jesus in acknowledging that Simon's new name is Peter Petros, which means rock. And he says, upon this rock, upon this, Peter, your God-given insight into the lordship of Jesus Christ, on this, in all who will ever have that revelation, this will build, this on this, I will build my church. It will be unshakable. And so this is a moment of just, wow, Jesus has spoken incredible words of promise and blessing to Peter, and we have clarified that he is no longer Simon, which some say means unstable, like shifting sand, and he is instead Peter, which means rock. He is solid. He is strong. This is the prophetic destiny of Peter. And then, in the very next scene, how shocking. Verse 21, from that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord. This shall never happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." And so, here we have in these few verses, seemingly, that this disciple is called Simon, unstable. And then it seems he's called Peter, the rock. And then, as it would seem, he is called Satan, the hindrance. We have talked a lot about how Peter is such an admixture of wanting to be committed, wanting to be a good disciple, wanting to be a loyal follower of Jesus, wanting to do well, and yet so often failing. We've seen how his character is mixed, and yet Jesus sees him for the rock that he is. He already knows that Peter is going to be the foundational preacher at Pentecost. And he already has seen into this destiny for Peter, and he's called it out in Peter. And then we come to this scene where Jesus is as angry as you'll ever see Jesus be. We don't see this kind of strength of rebuke from Jesus anywhere else other than maybe with the Pharisees, where he will often speak to them very harshly and with brash words, say you're like whitewashed tombs, you're full of dead men's bones, but you look good on the outside, because you're saying you're hypocrites. He would talk to the religious leaders that way. And there were times in which Jesus got especially mad at the religious leaders when he saw how they were preventing people from coming into the outer court of the temple and really being able to worship. Instead, they were using people, and they were taking their money in this elaborate system of exchange rates, and they were abusing the whole temple sacrificial system. And he got mad about that, and he turned over their tables, and he said, "My Father's house is supposed to be a house of prayer." You see these scenes of Jesus getting really upset in these moments, and you learn a lot from it. But what's different about this is Peter. This is the same Peter that Jesus had just affirmed. This is Jesus' friend. This is his close companion. This is his disciple. And what is different about this, it stands out in such strength of rebuke, is that he singles Peter out. He looks at Peter. And it's one thing if you are in a crowd and someone rebukes you as a group of people. It's another if you're singled out. If after the game the coach says to the whole team, "You didn't play well today," it's one thing. But if he picks you out and says, "Alan, you didn't play well today," it's another thing. And so in this moment, Jesus has and whatever purposes he has in mind here, whatever he's doing, he looks at Peter when he says this. And it's understandable that Jesus would be upset with the religious leaders of his day, because the religious leaders of his day wanted to kill Jesus. And so you could understand in the natural sense of the word why Jesus would be so upset with them. But Peter here is not wanting to kill Jesus, he's wanting to protect Jesus. He is actually wanting to see Jesus be spared from the very suffering that Jesus has just forecast. And isn't that ironic, therefore, that the strongest rebuke, arguably, that you ever see on the lips of Jesus comes at a moment where his friend speaks from good intentions and respect for Jesus, in yearning for Jesus to fulfill the messianic expectations that Peter had. And Peter had just been affirmed for saying that flesh and blood had not revealed it to him, but God had revealed it to him, that Jesus is the Messiah. And all Peter wanted was for Jesus to be that Messiah. And as we'll see today, there was nowhere in Peter's mind that it fit for Jesus to be a suffering Messiah. And he wanted Jesus to be okay. And it's so ironic then that Jesus gets as upset as you'll ever see Jesus in the strength of this rebuke. Let's talk about it. I spent a lot of time this week on the question, is Jesus really calling Peter Satan? I'm just going to say up front that after many hours of meditation on this, I've decided no way. That Jesus is in whatever way speaking to Satan while looking at Peter, not that Peter is demonized, but that what Peter has said so aligns with the conspiracy of hell and the intentions of hell that he looks at Peter, who spoke the words, but he's speaking back to Satan. And I'll try to show that to you. And in the end, what I want to show you is something that is much broader and deeper than that question. But some of you might have that question, and I was on that question a lot this week. Let's start with this. Like Peter's life, these passages show us how life is, as much as we wish it weren't, it is an admixture of Good Friday and Easter, of our sorrows and our adversities and our triumphs. And anybody that's ever around me very much or hears me preach the gospel knows I believe the gospel is a gospel of triumph, and that the overarching message of the Bible is that we are made into, through Christ, more than conquerors, and that therefore there's a victory tune that runs all the way through the gospel. But I don't ever want you to hear me say, though, that that means that Christians are somehow immune from the pain of this world. We are not. And it's strange how life comes at you, isn't it? Just a few weeks ago, I went through a 2-week span, and I thought later, how odd, the things that can happen in just a couple of weeks. I was very eager to go and enjoy some time of really kind of decompressing after the busyness of December. The life and the cycle of a preacher, ebbs and flows differently from most other folks' cycle in life, and when things get busy. For other people, sometimes I'm letting down, and sometimes when I'm building up, it's a letdown time for others. And so after the holidays, then is a time, and here's where I was going to decompress, was I was going to have some time in Florida. First, at a minister's gathering that a group of men I cherish being with and learn from a lot. I was there for several days, and then the family was coming down to join, and the warmth of the sunshine in Orlando in the middle of the winter. And so I traveled, and in the midst of it, I picked up a cough, a little cold, and I was coughing, but that was okay. I was in Florida. And on the third day that I was there, the family wasn't there, and I got this sad phone call from my wife that our little beagle, Reese, who had been part of our family for 12 years, that he was very sick, and that they had to make the difficult decision that it was time for Reese to be put to sleep. He wasn't eating. He was in terrible pain, and they'd found a tumor. I wasn't there to help with the hard decision, and it was just I'll never be one of those people that says, "Oh, it's just a dog." Until you have one, you realize the things you love, you grieve when they're gone, And so without me there, they made that difficult decision at the vet, my wife, my daughter. But then Bennett flies in from Texas. The family comes down to Florida, and we spend some days in the sunshine with Mickey Mouse. But I'm also coughing during this time. And when I get back just before a big snow comes, I go to the doctor, and he says, "You've got some pneumonia." Never had pneumonia in my life. And then I'd spend a week or so recuperating from pneumonia. It's all in a week or two of time. This is life, isn't it? Mickey Mouse and Florida and sunshine and big, wonderful celebrations with the family around dinner tables at Disney, and the loss of the pet that you love, and fighting off pneumonia. And life is like this. It comes at us this way. My friend and mentor Dudley Hall put it like this years ago: every day seems to have a little bit of Good Friday and Easter in it. That there's something about life that is very, very important to accept. That in this world, Jesus said, you'll have trouble. And something about accepting that without it becoming a sense of defeat, but accepting its reality as a Christian who lives in the victory of the gospel, becomes absolutely essential. And everything within us wants to resist that notion. That's part of what's going on with Peter here. As soon as he gets the revelation from the Father in heaven that Jesus is the Messiah, everything within him wants to gravitate towards, this means, therefore, that we get a life of victory unto victory unto victory that does not include the sufferings of this world. And that's not true. Scott Peck, in his famous The Road Less Traveled, began it this way: life is difficult. This is a great truth, Peck writes, one of the greatest truths. It is a great truth because once we truly see this truth, we transcend it. Once we truly know that life is difficult, once we truly understand and accept it, then life is no longer difficult. Because once it is accepted, the fact that life is difficult no longer matters. He continues, fearing the pain involved, almost all of us, to a greater or lesser degree, attempt to avoid problems. We procrastinate, hoping they'll go away. We ignore them, forget them, pretend they do not exist. We even take drugs to assist us in ignoring them, so that by deadening ourselves to the pain, we can forget the problems that cause the pain. We attempt to skirt around problems rather than meet them head on. We attempt to get out of them rather than suffer through them. And as he continues in the chapter, he says, this tendency to avoid problems and the emotional suffering inherent in them is the primary basis of all human mental illness. In the succinctly elegant words of Carl Jung, neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. But the substitute itself, Peck writes, the substitute itself ultimately becomes more painful than the legitimate suffering it was designed to avoid. If you could understand those words, it would not only be most instructive to you in your life, but it would be profoundly healing. And oftentimes when people carry misconceptions as a Christian about what it is to be a follower of Christ and what it means to live in the victory of Christ, and they begin to get notions not unlike Peter, may it never be so that there will be this kind of suffering that you're talking about, then we're falling into the very temptation that Scott Peck is writing about and the very thing that Jesus himself ultimately is rebuking, and that is that there is some avenue by which you get to avoid the pain of this world. And that's not the promise of the gospel. The promise of the gospel is that though there's trouble in this world, you can take heart, Jesus says, because I have overcome the world. The hope of the gospel is not that there's no such thing as pain, that there's no such thing as the cross. The hope of the gospel is that there always is a resurrection. The hope of the gospel is in Jesus Christ's promise that there is life, and abundant life in Him. Though we go through these temporary adversities, we can not only triumph in them, we can rejoice in their midst. This is the secret of the Christian life. Now, one of the key words here in our text today is really in Greek one little word when it says, from the time Jesus began to show His disciples that He must go to Jerusalem. It really is one little word, a verb that means it is necessary. And this becomes a very important verb in the narrative of the life of Jesus, especially in the Gospel of Luke. But here in the Gospel of Matthew, see this word, He began to show them that it was necessary, it was essential, it was something that must happen. And this is a powerful and profound thing for Peter to begin to hear this from Jesus, that what He's saying is not something that was optional, it was something that must happen. Years ago, in one of his early books, Max Lucado wrote about a well-worn preacher's illustration that tells of a drawbridge operator who was horrified one day to discover an unthinkable dilemma. That his little boy had been out playing around at the bridge and had gone down under and was playing amidst the great big gears of this drawbridge, when unexpectedly the bridge tender realized that a locomotive was coming that was a passenger train carrying hundreds of passengers, and he had to open the bridge, but there was no time. If he took time to go and get his son away from these gears that would surely crush him, then it would be too late. And he had to close the bridge in time for the passenger train. And so in a moment of terrible pathos, the bridge operator decides that he will close the bridge so that the train can pass by, and his son is crushed, and the thoughtless passengers on the locomotive all pass by happily, talking with one another and drinking their drinks and eating refreshments and have no idea that a father's son had just perished in order to save their lives. It's a well-worn preacher's illustration, and it is full of many similarities to the gospel. The unthinking people who don't know what has been done for them, the Father's unbelievable sacrifice and agony of his heart, the amazing sacrifice and what has been done. All of that is true of the gospel, but Lucado made this point, there's a glaring error, of course, that makes it so unlike the gospel of Christ, and it is this: the gospel of Christ's cross was no accident. It was by God's set purpose. It wasn't a cosmic dilemma that suddenly emerged. Men of Israel, hear these words: Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. This Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. Those were the words of our Peter at the Pentecost sermon. By God's definite plan. Peter would come to understand this, and this would be what he proclaimed. It was what had been prophesied in Isaiah. It was the will of God to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. Lucado wrote this. What does it mean? It means Jesus planned his own sacrifice. It means Jesus intentionally planted the tree from which his cross would be carved. It means he willingly placed the iron ore in the heart of the earth from which the nails would be cast. It means he voluntarily placed his Judas in the womb of a woman. It means Christ was the one who set in motion the political machinery that would send Pilate to Jerusalem. And it also means he didn't have to do it, but he did. It was no accident. If you were to make the drawbridge metaphor accurate to the gospel, the story would have to be altered, of course, in an unimaginable way. The Father would have told the Son to go and play amongst the bridge's machinery on purpose, and the Son would have known what was going to happen and would have voluntarily gone, knowing all that was at stake. And the reason that we struggle to understand the gospel is because any of us could never imagine a father doing that, nor a son resolutely agreeing to it and being obedient even unto death on a cross. And the reason that the atonement and the gift of Christ is so hard to understand is not so much that I can't understand why it was necessary for him to die in my place, but what I can't understand is the extent of the love that would do such a thing for one such as I. In other words, what we need a revelation of is just how wide, how long, how deep, how high is the love of God, because the love of God has been set upon you, and Christ and the depths of his love has gone to the Christ for you. He made a choice. It is necessary. He must go, Jesus said. In this world, there is not only the inevitability of suffering, but in a very real sense, there is the necessity of it. There will be a time in which there will be a new heaven and a new earth, and there will be no inevitability or necessity of suffering or death. But as long as we are here, there is, even for those that are in Christ, a necessity of a kind of suffering that we could rightly call a cross or a letting go, that is essential for the life-giving power of God to come forth in our lives. Jesus put it succinctly: unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. In other words, by way of metaphor, the seed has to suffer and let go of being a seed, that is to die, or there'll be no fruitfulness. But the fruit comes, and the best fruitfulness comes when there is a willingness to suffer the pain of completely letting go. What I'm saying is not that God orchestrates someone's cancer, not that he's a fickle father who is ready to beat his children. That's not the gospel. But what I'm saying is that in this world, there is a cycle of taking hold and letting go, of taking hold, of letting go, of taking hold and letting go. And there will come a time in which we come come to our very end and we breathe our last, and there will be an instinct within our body to keep on breathing and to keep on breathing, but at some point we will be released, and our spirit will be released, and we'll slough off this mortal frame, and in the moment that looks like the greatest loss, it will be our greatest gain, because those things that we perceive to be loss can, in God's economy, become our greatest gain. And the things that you've lost in your life, and the disappointments of your life, and the adversities that you're facing now, and some of the things that you most want to hold on to, and yet God is willing you to let go of, therein, like the seed that falls to the ground, is the power of God's resurrection. Peter's struggling here because ever since he was taught as a little Jewish boy about the Son that was coming, about the Messiah, he was taught that he was going to be one who would reign in glory, that he was one who would be like David. David expanded the borders of Israel. He set up his political throne. And what did David do? He put away the enemies of Israel so the people could prosper. And this is what Peter had in mind. This is what the Messiah is supposed to do. This is what the Son of David is supposed to do. Psalm 22, which we from the Christian perspective see prophesies the words that Jesus then echoes on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" is interestingly mentioned in the Jewish Encyclopedia this way, quote, "This final utterance was in all its implications itself a disproof of the exaggerated claims made for Jesus after his death by his disciples." This is Jewish scholars writing. "No real Messiah could suffer such a death. It is an impossible article of belief, which detracts from God's sovereignty and absolute otherness." That well defines what would have been in the heart of Peter or any other Jewish believer of that day. How could God be God and suffer in the way that Jesus is saying? Peter thinks of scriptures like Psalm 2. "I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, 'You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him." There's the picture of the Son. The Son of the living God. And Peter had just announced, you're the Christ, you're the Son of the living God. You are Psalm 2. That's what Peter has confessed. And Jesus has affirmed it. But you see, what Peter is leaving out is there's another image of the anointed one, the appointed one by God, that is also prophesied. For example, in Isaiah 42, "Behold my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He'll bring forth justice to the nations. He'll not cry aloud or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break. A faintly burning wick he will not quench." There's an image Isaiah speaks of in Isaiah 53 of one who we esteemed not and had no beauty that we would look upon him, and suffered in our place. And Peter has in mind the Son of the living God, who is the King, but not the suffering servant who would die in the place of a people. Tim Keller has made a fascinating observation that at Jesus' baptism, when the Father says, "This is my Son, in whom I'm well pleased," that God spoke and he quoted Psalm 2 about the Son who will reign. And he put it together with the image of Isaiah 42 with the exact words of Isaiah, "In whom I'm well pleased, in whom my soul delights. This is my Son, in whom I'm well pleased." Psalm 2 has been joined with Isaiah 42 at Jesus' baptism. So Peter is missing out on the deep mystery of life in its letting go and its taking hold. He's missing out on understanding the nature of the Messiah. But he is speaking forth words that are constituting Jesus' greatest temptation. In order to understand what Jesus says here in Matthew 16, you really must go back to Matthew chapter 4. I invite you to go there. If you have your Bible, go back to Matthew chapter 4 and look at this scene. Well, after Jesus has been baptized, then he's led by the Spirit out into the wilderness, and he goes on a 40-day fast, so he's weak. His body's weak. Remember, he's fully God, but he's fully human. And in Matthew 4, verse 3, we read about this temptation that comes from the devil himself. Verse 3, the tempter came and said to him, "If you're the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But he answered, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and set him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it's written, he'll command his angels concerning you. And on their hands they'll bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone." And Jesus said to him, "Again it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test." And again the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said, "All these I'll give you if you'll fall down and worship me." Then Jesus said, "Begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve." In Luke's version of this, it adds the line, "And the devil left him until an opportune time." What was happening in these temptations? It's very interesting. If you look through the Gospels, we know the writer of Hebrews says Jesus was tempted in every way that we're tempted. So he was not immune from any appetite of the flesh or any temptation that we might face in our lives. But what you see in the direct encounter of spiritual warfare that he has with the devil himself is that Jesus is not primarily tempted with the allures of materialism or the lusts of and wooing of some prostitute, or he's not tempted to become a thief. You don't see him. We never have that sense of the deepest agony of sweating blood over those types of things. But here when he's hungry, here's when he's tired, here's when he's beginning his ministry, what is it that the devil is offering him? What do these temptations have in common? If you just turn these stones to bread, then you won't be hungry. If you'll just defy gravity, you'll prove you're the Lord. If you would just take all of the thrones of this world by just simply acknowledging me. What does all this have in common? Phil Yancey, in his excellent book, The Jesus I Never Knew, deals with this temptation scene with tremendous insight and says this is essentially the temptation that the devil brought to Jesus. And that was to deny his humanity while only grasping his divinity. To do the stuff of God, but not the stuff of a human being. To bypass hunger. To defy gravity. To take all of what it meant for him to be here as God, but to not really be human. He was offering a temptation of a shortcut to glory, a way that would be skipping the cross, skipping the painful stuff of being a human being. And so, at the end of all this temptation, at Matthew 4, verse 10, Jesus said to him, "Begone, Satan." Now, what you need to know is that phrase, that verb there, hupago, begone, is the exact phrase that Jesus uses in Matthew 16 when he says, "Get behind me." It's the same phrase. What he says here in Matthew 4 is exactly what he says while he's looking at Peter. Hupago satana. Go away. Be gone. This is the strongest rebuke that Jesus has, and it is a rebuke that was spoken In Matthew chapter 4, Luke said the devil left Jesus until an opportune time. Here was an opportune time. In Peter's glorious revelation of Jesus Christ, and then Jesus began to say, now, my friends, my brothers, I need to tell you what is going to happen. I am going to go, and I'm going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going into the headquarters of the religious spirit of this world. And there I'm going to suffer many things. And it's going to be the religious leaders, the one who should bless me, but instead they're going to hurt me. And I'm going to have to die. But on the third day, I'm going to be raised again. And it was to that Peter said, no, may it never be. It was a double negative. He said, no way shall it ever happen at all. No, Jesus, no, is what he's saying. That can't be what the Messiah is all about. And Jesus, when he heard Peter talking like that, Jesus looked at him and he said, I know that voice. That is the same voice that I heard in the wilderness after my baptism. And so he said the same thing that he said in Matthew 4, Hupago Satana, be gone. I rebuke you. No! No! Whatever you tempt me with, don't tempt me with this. Why is he so mad? Because it was for this purpose that he'd come. Here's the irony, here's the love, here's the beauty of it. In whatever way he was mad at Peter, and he wasn't calling him Satan, he was speaking to Satan, but he was looking at Peter. He was saying, what you've said is so aligned with the very thing that Satan said to me to try to stop my ministry in the first place. And the reason that he was mad was because he loved Peter so much. If you stop me from suffering and dying, then I can't save you. He would say similar things to Peter. When Peter would say, you can't wash my feet. And Jesus said, if you don't let me wash you, you have no part of me. He is saying, you must let me suffer and die. There's so much at stake. What if Jesus had taken the crown without the cross? If he'd taken the crown, the glory, but never the cross, he'd never know what it was really like to be human and to suffer and die. And the writer of Hebrews wouldn't be able to say that he was tempted in every way that we are tempted. In order to be tempted as we've been tempted, he had to really be human. He had to really face the temptations. He had to really go through the suffering. He knows what you're going through because Jesus went through it. He did not deny his humanity in order to only attain his deity. He is God, he is man, and he has died for you. And had he listened to Peter, we would have no advocate who understands what we're going through. It would mean if he'd taken the crown without the cross, there'd be no payment for your sin. There'd be no justice, therefore, in releasing a spiritual inheritance to you. Because through the cross, not only did Jesus be reckoned as if he'd committed your sin, but you have been reckoned as if you'd lived his meritorious life. And there'd be no justice in the world because sin would not have been punished, and therefore you and I would still be under our sin. And if he had not died, but he had only lived his glorious life, then he would have never been resurrected. And if he'd never died and been resurrected, then when we died, we wouldn't be resurrected, and we wouldn't reign in glory with him forever. And all the prophecies and promise of God in the Old Testament would be rendered invalid if Jesus had listened to Peter that day. So yes, Jesus was mad on that day. Yes, he looked at Peter, this very man that he had just blessed, and said, I'm going to build my church on you. And he heard this voice saying, no, you must never suffer. And when he heard that, everything rose up within him in the spiritual battle. And he said no to the devil. He said no to the enemy, because I love you, Peter. I love my disciples. And it's for this purpose that I have come. The Son of Man must go and suffer many things, be crucified, dead, buried, and raised from the dead. You learn a lot about a person if you find out what they get most mad about. And Jesus was mad that day at the devil. And he was mad because it was the primal temptation that he faced. Would he be able to keep his commitment to suffer and die in our place. And the good news of the gospel is, yes, he did. He died for Peter and you and me because he refused to listen to Peter that day. And that's the gospel.